Hi, my name is Milani Douglas, and I am happy to be a part of the 2020 Africana Film Festival for this illustrious panel and this discussion. It is the fifth year, and we are going to have a great conversation about who gets to tell the story, the Black narrative, and then also all the work that goes into it. So I'm excited to bring in everyone that's going to be a part of this discussion. We have some wonderful guests, and even though I could introduce everybody, I would love if you all spoke and tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'll start. That's okay with everyone.
Sure.
My name is Dwan Reese, and I am Associate Director for the Office of Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was formerly Curator of Music and Performing Arts there and have been at the museum for 11 years. Have a professional background working in museums on a variety of projects in arts and history and community-based exhibitions. And I'm happy to be here with this panel and talk about storytelling and who gets to tell what story.
Gail, can we hear from you?
Sure, of course. I am Gail Jessup White. I'm Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at Monticello. I'm also a descendant from two families that were enslaved at Monticello, the Hemmingses and the Hubbards, and from Thomas Jefferson through one of his great grandsons. I come to Monticello with a passion for history, a passion to tell these stories. I have a personal narrative that I'm always proud to share with people because it speaks to who we are as Americans and who we are as Black Americans and what we were able to endure for us to be here today. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. Um, in addition to that, I have a background in communications. I used to be a TV reporter and anchor a lifetime ago. So I bring that experience to my storytelling, and I am very pleased to be here with old friends and new friends.
Hello, I'm Adele Johnson, Executive Director of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, located in Richmond, Virginia. I've been with the museum for about 3 years now, and I'm new to the museum world and absolutely loving it. I have been a member of the Black History Museum for many years and always wanted to work there, but somehow it just never worked out. But now I'm there and I am absolutely thrilled. Our mission at the museum is to preserve stories that inspire. So we tell the untold stories, the undertold stories, and often the forgotten stories about African Americans who have done great things, not just in Richmond and Virginia, but in the nation and the world. So I'm really thrilled to be there and thrilled to be here today.
Well, it is a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. What I was most excited about when I got the invitation to moderate this panel is to talk with you all about your work. Because before we talk about who gets to tell the story, I think it's also important to talk about the work that goes into actually getting a story told. Because we know that behind the scenes, there has to be people who have to open the way and get it approved. And I would like to know, and so what I appreciate about you all is the work that you've done that have brought a lot of women of color to the table and have opened the way. But what are some things that you are doing at your institution? And Adele, I would love to hear from you first because you're coming into the museum world and it's a new space for you. So I'd love to hear kind of what you brought into the space that was new and then also what you were happy to find when you got here about opening the way for these stories.
So, yes, I am very new. I have a background in nonprofit management, so I have been with nonprofits most of my career, and I brought that with me to the museum. So, luckily, a lot of my the skills that I've built over the years will transfer or have transferred very easily into the museum. And I'll tell you, just being in Richmond has been a big part of the success of the museum and my success being there. because Richmond is a very historic city. There are a number of famous African Americans from Richmond, and I think everybody has a story to tell, and everybody wants to tell that story. I am blessed to have an 89-year-old mother-in-law who lives with us, and there's not too many questions that I can ask her that she doesn't have an answer to, that she can add to the stories. We also have a number of Black historians right here in Richmond that we can call upon very easily. And I think because we're in this historic neighborhood, we're also able to call on our friends in other institutions. There are museums, historical sites, statues, there are libraries, all within walking distance of the museum. So all I have to do is make a quick phone call or walk out the door and I can find a story. So it's been very easy to do that, to identify the stories and to embellish the stories. And that's one of the things that I've really tried to do since I've been at the museum, is to make sure that everybody on our staff, as well as our docents, has a story to tell. They're not all the same stories because we are not singular people. We are multifaceted. So we want to make sure that we are telling not just one story, but telling different sides of the stories that we share.
You're on mute.
Pardon me. Dwan and Gail, I know that for Dwan coming to this museum, for there's such a backstory of how the museum even came to the mall. And then Gail, how even some of the stories that you're bringing and making sure are being told. How did you all find your network as an important part of bringing these stories to the forefront, and even bringing the institution and the stories to the forefront?
I think the network was already there. Very much so. If you look at the history of what it took to build the National Museum, this museum is built on the shoulders of those before us, even in the African American Museum movement. And all of that really started with an opportunity to talk about African American contributions to the national narrative. So the bedrock was already built. And one of the things we talk about storytelling, we talk about giving, voices to the unvoiced, and every voice, every story matters. And that's part and principle about everything we do. There are a network of people who are really invested in this institution and wanted to share those stories that hadn't been heard. And I think as a museum, we're very committed to that and working with community groups, people throughout the country, internationally. Everyone, our curators really take what we do and the human interactions. But as we talk about storytelling, I think it's important also to mention that the way we tell stories in African American museums or other culturally specific museums is also a lesson to the world. It's also a lesson to how stories can be told, how stories can be more inclusive. So not only in addition to telling a story of an individual group or culture or time period, we're showing that full storytelling is inclusive and represents different voices, and not that the feats of a few great men or anything like that. So it's not only the stories we tell, but the method we do it that really is an example for organizations worldwide.
There are a few points I'd like to make here, piggybacking on what my colleagues have said. Monticello is not an African American museum. It is an American museum that seeks to include all stories, and that has not always been the case at Monticello. It has been through decades of effort on the part of curators and historians and archaeologists who so long ago started doing archaeological digs among the remains of the artifacts of are seeking artifacts of the enslaved, what was left of slave dwellings, mostly stone and outlines. And it grew, it grew. It grew into an initiative called the Getting Word Oral History Project. And that project sought some 28 years ago now to find stories from the descendants of the enslaved. And we began collecting and archiving stories from literally hundreds of people descended from the enslaved community of Monticello, keeping in mind that Thomas Jefferson owned 607 men, women, and children throughout his lifetime, which made him one of the largest slaveholders in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's a lot of people that the primary author of the Declaration of Independence owned. So it's essential that the story of those people be shared at the place where American democracy was born. The paradox of that is overwhelming. And it is that story that we tell with partners like the National Museum of History and Culture, African American Museum of History and Culture, and the Black History Museum of BHMVA, Black History Museum of Culture and History of Virginia. We have partnered with both of those institutions to bring to life what was originally called Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello when it opened at the Smithsonian in 2012 and evolved into the paradox of slavery, the paradox of freedom, the paradox of liberty, I'm so sorry, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, now at the Black History Museum in Richmond, Virginia. So we work with partners and we are informed in the work we do by our partners at African American museums and by the community, by the Black community, and by the descendants of the enslaved community at Monticello. And the work is ongoing. It does not stop. It cannot stop. There are new stories that emerge all the time. There are new discoveries that emerge all the time. There's work that goes on because we are not living in a world where slavery or the legacies of slavery have been obliterated. They continue to exist. We read it in the headlines every day. So we have to tell these stories. We cannot forget. We cannot forget that the way we live today is a result of the way our nation was started more than 200 years ago.
I love what you all are saying and the connections between your words, especially about how these stories and narratives evolve. What are some strategies that you all have had to use to sometimes to evolve a story to make sure that it's told, and also in making sure that the narrative does not always fall back to a singular narrative or the common narrative of who we know, but getting those unknown stories told as well?
You know, I deal with that a lot. When I first started my career, you know, as anyone, you take the next job and try to build a career, but some way or other, I started doing a lot of community-based exhibitions, a lot of history museums that, you know, in the early infancy were trying to diversify and reach out to communities. And that was probably one of the best learning experiences I had because, you know, we have museum institutions, but it's really a ground up, it's a shared authorship. And if anything, what I do, and I've carried it into my work at the Smithsonian, that it is careful listening. I may be a scholar, but I'm not the expert. And that if you have that sense of generosity and willing to learn what people have to tell you and crafting those stories in your institutions, I think there's a certain authenticity. You know, I like to see myself as a museum person, as a facilitator. And so I am facilitating these opportunities to give people a voice. I'm also very careful about the stories that get told because we so often get into traps. We talk about the popular narratives and, you know, the same people and the same stories gets told over and over again. And in all of my work, I've always been committed to those stories we don't know anything about, because that is the fuller and inclusive picture of who we are. They're diverse perspectives, stories, experiences, regions, and they not only deserve to be known, but they're an important part of the fabric of what history is.
One of the things that I've found is that as we tell our own stories as part of the overall broader story, it makes a difference to the visitor. We have probably 45% of our visitors are white. And one of the stories that I don't typically do tours, but one of the stories that I tell is about the Green Book. We have the Green Book on display. We have many pages from Virginia that we show. And then I tell the story about, I grew up in New Jersey. We took a family trip to Florida, a road trip. We stopped in Alabama at a restaurant to eat. Well, mistake, but didn't know it at the time. We went in, we sat. The waitress never came over. Finally, one of the other customers came over and said, colored people are served in the back. My father, West Indian with a really quick temper, wanted to sit there, wanted to remain there. But my mom, thinking about safety, told us that we should leave. So we left, and we thought we would go around the back just to check and see what it was like, and found that it was a very nice, clean area outside the kitchen, and of course, Black people were cooking. Well, we had a great meal, we left, and drove to Florida. Had we known about the Green Book, we would have been able to identify places that were either Black owned or welcomed Black people, but we didn't know that at the time. So when I tell that story to anyone really, but more importantly to our white visitors, I think it makes a difference because they don't know about the Green Book. They don't think about the fact that Black people were not welcomed everywhere. So we're trying to tell a story in a way that makes an impact on their lives and makes it memorable for them.
I think that's a good point. And at Monticello, most of our guests and most of our staff are white. However, people who come to Monticello for a historical experience or to learn about Thomas Jefferson also have to learn about the people he enslaved. And there were always more Black people on that little mountain than there were white people. So no one owns these stories. These stories belong to all of us. And it's very important that white staff, for example, learn to tell these stories with compassion and sensitivity in order to convey to our white guests the trauma of what was experienced on that mountain. Monticello is a beautiful place, but people were held captive there. So when a guest comes to Monticello, they have to learn that. It's essential to the experience, and it allows for a diverse sharing of the stories that and the lives that people experienced. And that's why it's so important to have our community influencers involved and our descendants involved. It's within the living memory of some people. Adele just mentioned an experience she had as an adult traveling south. It's in her living memory. My own sister can remember my great grandmother who was an enslaved person. So it's in people's living memories that we have enslaved ancestors. We know them. My sister knew her. So yeah, there are different ways of telling these stories, but I feel that one of the best ways is to for people to share their personal experiences, for people to talk about their ancestors, and no one's story is any better, no one's experience is any better than anyone else's. We all, as Black people, share a certain trauma. That is the link that holds us together. That's part of what makes us Black, that our ancestors had this trauma that has been passed down to us. And our white staff members learn that and share that with our white guests.
I think there's one more thing to add when you're talking about Adele told the personal story.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things in other institutions, we tell the stories of ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the extraordinary. It's not just the names we know. And I think that personalizes it and also finds points of connection for people who go through exhibitions. You may not see similarities of a big artist or a famous historical figure, but when you have objects of ordinary people and talking about their stories and that value that there's no one experience, that there's a certain kind of humanity that comes in it that really recognizes the whole African American experience as valuable and part of that larger narrative.
I'm
I
so
think that's
glad that
so
you.
right, and it's so huge. If I could just add, with the traveling exhibition, we have everyday objects that the enslaved used: a comb, a toothbrush, a toy. Nothing can be more humanizing than these ordinary objects. Nothing can say more that I was here, I lived, than these ordinary objects. And that's part of what we do at Monticello. That's part of what we share with our partners at the African American museums. It's part of what breathes life into people whose voices were diminished and ignored for so long. Again, it's essential to making people whole and humanizing them, and for us to understand who we are and how we live today. Common, ordinary objects.
I'm so glad that you brought that up and to speak about the importance of the everyday story and the ordinary object. In the museum world or any cultural organization world, there's this push for audience. How have you found those moments where it was going against having the big name or the big topic and telling the everyday story where you've seen that everyday story shine and push through? And what have you done to make sure that that stays at the forefront and those stories are centered?
Well, for us, it's all about reaching out to the community and partnering and listening. Um, we had a situation a year and a half, 2 years ago, where I overheard a conversation between two young men about blackface. And I would say they were like maybe in their early 30s. And they didn't understand what the big deal was. You know, why don't we just forget about it and move on? And these were two black guys. And I was really, really surprised about that. And I thought, well, if this is true with them, then it's probably true with others of the same age group. So we decided to do a program about blackface. We found a documentary that provided background information, and then we had a panel to discuss the harmful impacts that are still felt today because of blackface. We had a very diverse audience. People were not afraid to ask questions. I was really thrilled that there were young people there, young meaning in their teens and 20s, as well as older people. And it was one of those situations where people were not afraid to ask questions, not afraid to have conversations. And, we had to cut it off because it was getting late. It was time to go home. But the conversation was so rich that they wanted to stay there. And I think it doesn't quite fit into an everyday person that we were talking about. But the conversation is one that would not have been had, I'm sure, if we didn't have that program. So we tried to bring forth themes like that people can think about, participate in, and then associate with what's going on today and what may happen tomorrow.
I think one of the things we do, and I think if you visited our museum and come to the Smithsonian, I think we do a good job of elevating those unknown stories and centralizing them. And I think one of the ways is that, you know, it's creating context and not framing it as just a little story here. This little story feeds into larger narratives, national stories, that there are connections. And as curators and staff, even programming, we help make those connections. So we're not presenting a story that's just an isolated, look at this wonderful object. We're making the connection because how this particular story of this particular person um, fits into the larger narrative. And it's part of even the principle when we're doing this kind of work that we all are connected. And so in telling these stories, whether it's in an exhibit, a public program, digital platforms, um, our responsibilities as professionals is to help people make those connections, whether it's with themes, whether it's with contemporary relevance, what have you, but that there is a connection, what's going on here with what's going on here at a larger national level, regional, what have you. And I think that's a strong principle that a lot of people are taking in their work, and I know we're pretty committed to that at the museum.
I think that um, we do a lot of excellent storytelling, and I think we do it through the best through our descendants, because not only are their stories authentic, they're, they're their lives. And we're lucky to have developed these excellent relationships with many members of our descendant community who want to be involved with Monticello. As a member of that community, I can't speak for all of them, but I can speak for some. Monticello is a home to us. We claim that space as ours. And we use that space to help people understand how important it is to collect these stories and how important our contributions were, not only those who were enslaved in Monticello, but the millions who were enslaved in the United States of America, to the foundation of this country and to the fabric of this country and to its success. So these stories, some of the people enslaved in Monticello went on to do great things. They were conductors in the Underground Railroad. William Monroe Trotter helped found the Niagara Movement, was a publisher. They became activists and politicians. However, there were some who did everyday things. They were teachers, they were moms, they were dads, they were gardeners, you name it. And we all contributed. We all have a voice. We all have something to say, and we all helped make this country, for better or worse, let's just say for better at the moment, what it is. And it's the descendants who share those stories with generosity and open hearts and understanding, and who I think do it best. Um, it's there when it comes to Monticello, at any rate, because it's their lives. They're sharing their lives and their history. And we have a great deal of respect and regard, and we honor our descendants for what they do for us. I can't hear.
Thank you. It is so beautiful to hear you all connect the dots between the symbiotic relationship between institution and community. A lot of times, institutions are looked at as something giving something to the community, when we know how much the community enriches the institution. And I think that you all have spoken very much to that. And I wanted to know how, as this, I think, and we're in times with COVID-19, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with all of the issues that are being pushed to the forefront, we're at this interesting point where that relationship is forced to deepen, and people are having to dig deeper and bring community in. What are some ways that you all have been able to pivot or expand the work that you are doing about centering the Black narrative and telling those stories, even in the midst of today's current times?
Wow. Well, I'll just jump in. We have been pivoting for years now. It's not new to us to adjust. Um, we are adjusting now by speaking very directly to what's happening around us. We're not trying to hide, we're not trying to dismiss. You can go on our website and see statements we've made regarding social justice and some of the turmoil we're experiencing. I said a moment ago, let's say that the moment is good. I only meant that because we're having a good conversation. Let's face it, we're living in very challenging times right now. And we speak to that at Monticello, and we're constantly updating and we're constantly making our staff aware and we're constantly training and we're constantly sharing. Um, so pivoting is what we are compelled to do because we're not going to hide and we're not going to ignore. Those times are long past.
I think, for our museum, we're just about to hit our 4-year anniversary. We've already been pivoting. We have the stories we tell in the museum, but we also have our ear to the ground. We respond in our programming, which is a much more quicker, but in the things that we offer people, even through digitally, publications, programming, even in new exhibit topics. So in some sense, particularly in 2020, we're doing what we've always done. I do think one kind of thing that we've added on our website, we have this platform called Voices of Resistance and Hope, and where we're inviting members of the community to share their stories in times of crisis. Initially, it started with COVID-19, and then we had the murder of George Floyd, and the resistance and the stands that people are coming through the country. But when we talk together as a staff, we listen to learn. What are the narratives and themes we need to address as curators? What are the things we need to collect? What's the programming we need to do to help our audiences make sense of where we are, where we've been, and where we might go in the future? And so, for most institutions, whether you're history or not, I think it's incumbent to listen to what's going on, to hear, because it's not only collecting and telling new stories, but also reframing old stories that help us make sense of where we are today.
We did something similar. We called it Voices for Change, and it was a 5-program series that we aired on Zoom. And we did this as a way to be a catalyst for conversation and action. We are really big on community conversations, and we hadn't been able to have any. So we thought this would be a good way. And what we ended up doing was asking just a wide variety of people to share their thoughts. So we would throw out a particular topic like protests or hateful things or racial inequities, and ask people what they thought about it and what they could do. So we were really encouraging them to think about who they are, what they stand for, and what they individually as well as what our community collectively could do. And we had such a positive response from this series that we're going to do it again and hopefully several times during the year. But I think, as you're saying, as I think all of us are saying, that really, I love what you said a minute ago, we listen to learn. So that's what we really want to do as well, or that we're doing as well, listening to learn, because we don't know everything. We are not the experts. We want people to share their stories. We want others to come in and help us to know more about the community. So Voices for Change was, a start in this direction for us, or a push in this direction for us. And then we were able to hold on to our exhibition, Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello. It was supposed to end in April, but we're able to keep it until November. So I think that's going to make a difference in the conversations that we have at the museum as well.
Well, there's so much that you all have given to this conversation, and I appreciate. And it's one thing that sticks out the most is radical listening, radical inclusion, radical sharing, and radical telling, radical narration. And so I want to ask you all, how can people find you, whether it's social media, how can people reach out to you if they want to continue this conversation that should be continued?
Well, I'm reachable through the museum, or I do have a social media handle. It's at Dwan Reese. And so you can send a tweet or reach me through a message, and I will respond, and always invite people to visit our website at nmaahc.si.edu for virtual programming and the latest resources that we have for people to engage with the museum content while we're kind of in this limited operating state.
Well, I have to say, I'm the very worst on social media. I mean, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm not good at it. However, I would encourage people to go to monticello.org to learn more about the work we're doing, to learn more about the traveling exhibition at Adele's museum. We're so thrilled to be there. To learn more about our live streams. And when we do our live streams, we just don't talk about the wonderful world of Thomas Jefferson anymore. You go to our live streams and you'll get a real authentic experience, and you'll hear about enslavement and the people who were enslaved there who made Monticello successful. And you'll hear about the legacies of slavery. And we talk very forthrightly and honestly about race at Monticello. I have conversations about race at Monticello. And if you go to monticello.org, you might be able to find something about Facebook. I'm so embarrassed that I don't know these things. I apologize.
It's okay.
But yeah, go to monticello.org and please do visit the Black History Museum to learn about the remarkable people who helped make this country great.
And as you can probably tell, Gail is my new best friend, because I love the way that she promotes the exhibition. Our website is Black History Museum, all spelled out, blackhistorymuseum.org. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I don't know any of those either, Gail, so don't feel bad. But we are out there. We are out there. And oh, look, they put it up for us. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
So I think we're pretty easy to find.
Well, in an age of information, we know that you all can find these wonderful ladies. We've given you enough tidbits to get to them, and I hope that you have enjoyed the conversation. I certainly have. Thank you all so much for all that you all have done in the field. Thank you for the traditions that you continue to carry. Thank you for showing so many of us the way, and also for the way that you have followed. It is a pleasure and honor to just be in conversation with you all. Thank you so much. And thank you for the Africana Film Festival. This is a wonderful 5th year. And we hope that there are many, many more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.